Hi, I'm Effie and this is What Effie Reads. As today is the start of a new month, I'm going to be going over what I read in March. Last month I read a total of 29 books. However, some of them were really short novellas, like 20 pages short. Because I went through so many books last month, I won't do a breakdown of every single book that I read because that would just make a really long video. So some of them I'm going to be grouping together and some of them I'm just going to be mentioning and moving on. Now I will try and put chapters and I'll put timestamps in the description down below. Since I don't like spoilers, I will try to keep this as spoiler free as possible. But if you're like me and don't like to know anything about the book, or you're worried that I am going to speak about spoilers, then please feel free to skip onto the next section. I started off the month by reading Spellbreaker by Charlie N. Holmberg. This is a book that follows Elsie, who is a spellbreaker, and Bacchus, who is a spell maker. The magic system's really interesting in this duology because you have the spell breakers who are poor and tend to be naturally gifted with the ability to undo any spell they come across, and they're also able to sense it, either sight, taste, smell. Whereas you've also got the spell makers who have to pay for their gifts. Now they have to have natural ability, but to actually gain the knowledge of all the different spells they have to pay to do that. So it's this really cool, almost Robin Hood stories, but really not. I really enjoyed the magic system, and I liked how much of a slow burn it was between Elsie and Bacchus. And then I also read the second book in the duology, Spellmaker, which continues on with their story. And again, it was this lovely kind of slow romance. I found that Spellbreaker was a lot more focused on the magic and the fantasy, whereas Spellmaker, the magic and the fantasy took a backseat and we got to follow the romance a bit more. I liked both of them, and I liked that they were two very different feeling stories. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell. So this book was the January Illumicrate pick, and it's a gay space opera basically. We have Keem and Janan who enter into an arranged marriage arranged by the Emperor for diplomatic purposes. There's no expectation of it being any more than a contract. However, it does have a beautiful slow burn romance as these two characters do slowly realise that their feelings for one another are mutual. I also enjoyed the space politics aspect of it. It was a really interesting story. Okay, the next book that I read was Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. This was a book that I'd had on hold for probably about a year from the library, so I was really excited to be able to read it. Unfortunately, it just didn't work for me. I can't really put my finger on exactly what it was. Okay, these next two books were kindly sent to me by the authors in exchange for an honest review. So the first book that we've got is Evelyn and the Kung Fu Headmaster by Quan Wu. This book takes place between London and China. We've got this young girl called Evelyn who's been created with the sole purpose of defeating the shapeless evil that's been terrorizing the world. However, she has a disagreement with her creator and runs off to China, where she learns Kung Fu at the Kung Fu University there. I think that this book is one that has a lot of potential, but probably could have done with a bit more editorial oversight. Quan Wu is an author that I would be interested to read more from, and she clearly has a unique perspective, but this book just wasn't for me. Okay, this second book that was sent to me by the author is So You Think You Know Life, Me Neither by Jameson Blackmay. Now, this is a collection of poetry that was written during the coronavirus pandemic, and it touches on themes of loneliness, relationships, depression, and nature. I found that there was a lot of poems that were really relatable and I loved. And then I got to the section on relationships, and I found that it gave me really nice guy vibes and made me feel really uncomfortable, especially as the subject of a lot of the poems seemed to be the same girl that it felt like the author had hard feelings against. So this was a book that I found really difficult to actually decide if I liked or not for those reasons. Next, I'm going to talk about some audiobooks that I listened to during the course of this month. So the first one I'm going to talk about was an absolute letdown, and that was All Systems Red by Martha Wells. This is a book that I feel like I've heard loads of people speak about really highly, but I feel like I was missing something with it. I couldn't get a handle on what the plot was meant to be, and I really couldn't tell you anything beyond the fact that there's a character called Murderbot and something about governor units. It's not an audiobook that worked for me in any way, and I don't really have any interest in continuing the series. Another audiobook that didn't work for me, but just because it didn't grip me, it wasn't a bad audiobook in any way. I just found myself zoning out and not being really interested, and that was False Hearts by Laura Lamb. I found the setting to be really well done. It was a futurescape, and it felt like realistically futuristic. And I enjoyed the narrative of these twins that were previously conjoined. It's something that I've seen written about just once before, and I think it's a trope that I enjoy. But this book just didn't keep my interest. And then we've got Punching the Air by Ibiza Boy and Yousef Salaam, which was a really engaging book as you follow a young man who is incarcerated for something that wasn't his fault and all the pain that he goes through. It's not an easy listen. I probably would have enjoyed it a little bit more without the poetry, as it is something that I struggle to engage with at times. But it was a really good audiobook to listen to, and I thoroughly recommend it. And the fourth audiobook that I listened to, and this was an audiobook I really, really enjoyed, and it was Chaos Reigning by Jessie Mihalik. This is the third and final installment in the Consortium Rebellion trilogy, which follows basically space princesses. They are space opera romances, and they're just so fun to read, or in my case, listen to. They have quite a bit of kind of space politics and intrigue, but they also have a sprinkle of spice for those that enjoy that in their books. This is a series that I got into before I really enjoyed romancing books. Like, I still don't think that I would lean towards picking up a book that was just romance, but I'm finding that as I read more and more, I'm enjoying romance as a subplot more and more as well. So if you like romance as a primary genre or a subgenre, I definitely recommend the Consortium Rebellion trilogy. The only non-fiction that I managed to read last month was The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which is essentially a book that explores how the justice system in America has been shaped to become a new version of the old Jim Crow laws that existed. This was not an easy book to read at all. Largely for the subject matter, but also because it was very academic in tone. But it's an important book, and I'm very glad that I read it, and I'm on the lookout for if there's any books that follow the same kind of issue in the UK, because I think it'd be really naive to be like, oh, that's America, it doesn't happen here. It does happen here. And I would like to have a book that explains that to back it up. The next book that I read was Dark Lullaby by Polly Ho Yen. Unfortunately, this book just didn't feel fresh to me. It wasn't a rehashing of any story that I'd read before, but it was an infertility dystopia, and it didn't feel like anything other than an infertility dystopia. To the point that what I think was meant to be a twist felt like it had been signalled pretty heavily from the start of the book. So when it came, I was like, yeah, and? So not a book that I would necessarily recommend, unless infertility dystopias are your jam, in which case you probably would really enjoy this book. I talked about this book in my previous video, and it is A Kind of Spark by Elle McNichol. So this book follows Addie, who is an autistic girl who, upon learning about witches and the way that witches were murdered, sees parallels between the way that she's treated and decides that she's going to petition for her village to erect a memorial in honour of all the witches that were killed. I found this book absolutely beautiful, and it had me gripped from start to finish, to the point that I decided to stay up to finish it. So I essentially read it in one sitting, and I look forward to reading it again in one sitting, again and again and again. So another book that was somewhat of a disappointment for me was Cinderella is Dead by Kalynn Bayron. I think my biggest issue with this book was that the image that I had in my head of it was that it would be a sapphic retelling of Cinderella, and that's not really what this book is. It's a book where the Cinderella story is real and it forms part of their lore, but it's not a Cinderella story, if that makes any sense at all. I also found the pacing to be really quite slow, and I pushed through hoping that it would get better. I was told that the second half got better, but it just didn't grip me in the way that I'd hoped it would. So during March, we had Becca's Bookathon, which was a 24-hour readathon. And during that time, I think I finished 10 books, but 7 of them were really short novellas. So the books that I read during Bookathon were Hansel and Gretel by Neil Gaiman, which essentially was just Hansel and Gretel with some pretty pictures. So I'm not mad about, but it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I also read The Goblins of Bellwater by Molly Ringwald. And that was just really disappointing for me because previously all of her books have been easy 5 stars and it just wasn't to the same standard. But also it was one of her earlier books, and I have to concede as well that the time frame meant that I couldn't sit and enjoy it. I did appreciate that the fae that it featured weren't your standard pointy-eared, quite attractive, very humanoid. It very much focused on goblins and other fae, which I really enjoyed. Okay. I also read Mrs. Death by Selena Gooden, and it follows Wolf, who decides to essentially become the autobiographer for Death, who is nothing like you might expect. Death is a working class black woman who shapeshifts to do her work unseen. It was a book that wasn't quite what I expected, but also was so beautiful, so heartbreaking, and just a treasure. And then there was an acknowledgements page that had me weeping. It seemed to effortlessly balance the fine line between true crime and fiction in a way that was truly engaging. The final proper book that I read for Bookathon was Volume 1 of the Shades of Magic graphic novel series, and this one's called The Steel Prince. And it follows King Maxim. It follows Maxim Marash about 30 years before the events of the Darker Shade of Magic series. I really enjoyed diving back into this world, but I found the graphic novel format a challenge. However, at the end of this bind-up, it included bits about the artwork, and I realised that I'd missed a lot of important parts of it, so I am looking forward to going back and reading it again when I pick up the rest of the series. So in addition to those full-length books and graphic novels, I also read the Out of Line collection from Amazon. It's a collection of short stories that are each presented in their own ebook. I'm not 100% sure what the theme that connects them all together is meant to be, as I thought it was maybe to do with motherhood and children. However, there was a couple of books that didn't follow that format. As has been my experience with previous collections from Amazon, generally most of the stories were very middle of the road. There was one or two that weren't for me at all, and then there was one that I really, really enjoyed. And the standout in this collection was Shine, Pamela Shine by Kate Atkinson. Something about the way that it was written made it really easy to engage with the protagonist, despite the fact that she was a menopausal woman who was divorced and had children. There was just so much of it that usually I would find difficult to relate to in a protagonist, but this time I found really easy to kind of relate and enjoy. So I would say if you are going to read this collection, read that one and maybe Graceful Burdens by Roxane Gay. But the rest of them, maybe give a miss. This is turning into quite the marathon, isn't it? But there's only a few more books that I need to speak about. So there's The Dying Game by Asa Avdek. I think it's meant to be a thriller. It's set in a future Sweden based on a altered past. There was some kind of politics that was made to seem like it was integral to the plot, but I couldn't wrap my head around. And then there wasn't any suspense to it. It just wasn't a very good book, in my opinion. So I read A Strange Hymn by Laura Thalassa. It's the second book in the Bargainer series, which follows a siren called Callie, who's made a string of bargains with infamous fairy bad boy the Bargainer, also known as Desmond. This book I'm not sure what to make of it. It felt like it went backwards with the relationship. Without spoiling what happens in the first book, there was a reasonable expectation that this book would have a lot more spice to it, or even the same level of spice as the previous one. And I think you get to over a quarter of the way through before you get any kind of spice. And then the plot was very meandering. It kind of did this and it did that. And it didn't engage at all. It very much felt like a middle book in a series, which it is, but I also know that middle books can be done well. Just this one wasn't. So one of the last books that I read last month was The Girls Are Also Nice Here by Laurie Elizabeth Flynn. It takes place over dual timeline as we see Ambrosia preparing for her reunion at university. We also see her as she's just starting university and she's becoming friends with Sully, who has no cares about what other people think of her and does what she wants. We see Ambrosia want to emulate Sully, and we know something bad's going to happen, but we don't know what. And I found the way that this book was constructed, you got just enough in each timeline to feel satisfied, but not enough to really know what had happened in the best way possible. So it kept me guessing and guessing. And then around the 50% mark, there was this fantastic reveal that I wouldn't have guessed and was so cleverly crafted that I just had to stop and go, really well done. I wasn't the biggest fan of the ending. It made sense with the rest of the book and what the characters had done. I just didn't like it. And we've reached the last book that I'm going to talk about. Hi, Editing Effie here. Unfortunately, I've taken half my face off and I've lost my light, but I got to this point in the editing and realised that I haven't actually spoken about one of my favourite books of the month, which was Sage and King by Molly Ringwald. It's a Merthyr book, so it's loosely based on Merlin and King Arthur. It follows Prince Zaya after he's thrust into the position of king, and he meets a young sage called Cole who has to tell him all about the secrets of the sages. And it's this beautiful slow burn romance that Ringwald does so well. I know earlier in the video I spoke about not loving the Goblins of Bellwater so much, but Ringwald's most recent romances are amazing, and this is the third of her recent romances that I've given 5 stars. So I recommend you check it out, especially if you love queer fantasy romance. And now back to the pre-recorded video. So this book I technically didn't finish in March. I actually finished it about 1:30 a.m. this morning. It's now the 1st of April, in case I don't get this video up today. And it is A Dark and Hollow Star by Ashley Shuttleworth. And this was the February Illumicrate pick. This book I really wanted to love. I'd heard such good things about it, but it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. Everyone tells you that this book is sapphic, it's gay, it's really gay, and it is technically. So pretty much every character is queer, which is absolutely fantastic. I love. There is also some non-binary rep in this book, which I really appreciated. The problem with saying this book is really gay and really queer and it's sapphic is I went into this book expecting it to be a romance, and what I got was barely any yearning, barely any crushing, and there is one kiss. That is all the action you get. One kiss on page 457. That's it. And it's difficult because this is the first book in a series, which I didn't know when I first found out this was the Illumicrate pick, but when I added it to my story graph, it did come up as being number 1 in a series. And this book very much reads like the first book in a series. It spends a long time establishing how the fairy world works, what the laws are, and going into a lot of detail. In fact, in my opinion, possibly too much. I found it really difficult to understand what Seelie and Unseelie was, and who was mortal, who was immortal. And the magic system, which I think I get at this point, I think it's elemental and different courts have different elemental magics. I think this book is setting up really well for the rest of the series, and I can appreciate that the romances are going to develop as the series progresses, but this book on its own just didn't do it for me. It was very slow. The villain felt two-dimensional, and I found myself getting lost every time a new element of the magic system or the law was brought up. But I'm very much looking forward to what this author brings out next. So honestly, I don't know what to think of this book, but it has got plenty of tabs in. If you've gotten to this point, thank you for sitting through this video. That was way too long as I wrapped up all of the books that I read in the month of March. I'm hoping that going forward, any of these wrap-up videos will be a bit shorter. I'm hoping I'll also learn how to not talk about every single book. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and feel free to comment below what you thought of any of these books. Have you got any recommendations of something that you think I would like to read? Let me know, and until next time, bye!